Welcome to Epic HFY Stories. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to check if you've subscribed to our channel. It's completely free, and subscribing will ensure that our stories show up more often in your feed. Eli's head felt like it was splitting open. His eyes fluttered, the world around him spinning. The low hum of something mechanical buzzed in his ears, though it didn't quite sound like the ship's engine. No, this was something else. Something much more alien. He pushed himself up from the cold metal floor. His legs were weak, and his arms ached. A sharp, metallic taste filled his mouth, a reminder of the impact. The crew, gone. The ship, wrecked. And him? He was just a lowly technician who had wandered too close to alien space. Alone. As Eli stumbled to his feet, his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He was no longer in the control room of his vessel. The walls shimmered, a soft, ethereal glow like moonlight. It was as though the very structure of the place was watching him. He looked around, his breath quickening. The entire room felt wrong, alive in some way he couldn't explain. Before he could process what was happening, two figures appeared in front of him, tall and silent, their skin a strange shade of gray-blue. Their armor glowed faintly, reflecting the eerie light around them. "Prisoner," one of them said in a voice that sounded more like a distant echo. The other didn't speak, but their presence was enough to make Eli's heart race. They grabbed him, unceremoniously shackling his wrists with cold, unyielding chains. He tried to protest, but his throat felt dry, and no words came out. He was too disoriented to fight back. They dragged him down a long hallway, the walls still shimmering, as if alive, watching. His legs buckled under him, but they didn't stop, just pulled him along like a rag doll. The strange light made everything seem unreal, like he wasn't on a spaceship, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere beyond Earth. Finally, they came to a massive chamber. The room stretched farther than Eli could see, filled with beings who towered over him. They were elegant, tall, their forms slender but imposing. They wore robes of deep gold, their skin smooth like polished stone, eyes glowing softly in the darkness. At the far end of the room sat a throne, golden and shimmering. And on it sat the Emperor. He was cold, regal, and his presence was overwhelming. Eli felt the weight of his gaze, even from a distance. His expression was one of barely contained fury, as if the mere existence of this human trespasser disgusted him. "You," the Emperor's voice boomed, resonating throughout the chamber, "have broken into our borders." Eli winced at the sound of the Emperor's voice. The words made his skin crawl. He couldn't help but feel like prey, something small, insignificant. The Emperor stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. The room fell silent as he stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Eli. "Shall I feed him to the beasts?" he asked. The crowd in the chamber laughed, a cold, mocking sound. Eli could barely stand, his legs trembling. He was at their mercy. There was no way out. But then, "Give him to me," a quiet voice interrupted the Emperor's cruel laughter. All eyes turned. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. She was young. No crown, no armor, no guards flanking her. Just a quiet, unassuming presence among the grandeur of the court. Her silver hair cascaded around her face, framing her soft features. Her head was lowered, and she looked almost forgotten, as if she were invisible to the rest of the world. It was Princess Varelia. The Emperor paused, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. "You want this creature?" His voice dripped with mockery. Varelia nodded once. Her eyes, glowing faintly, didn't waver from Eli. There was something different in them. something Eli couldn't quite place. "Fine," the Emperor sneered. "Take him. A gift for the infertile one. At least now you'll have someone to talk to." The crowd erupted in laughter again, but Varelia didn't react. She simply moved toward Eli, her presence quiet, yet oddly reassuring. She reached out, taking Eli's arm gently in her cold grasp. Her touch was soft but firm, guiding him forward. "Come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli couldn't understand the language she spoke, but he felt something in her voice. A kindness, a pain, something human, despite the fact that he was far from home, far from anything familiar. She wasn't like the others. She didn't look at him like a beast, an intruder. She looked at him as though she understood. He stumbled as she led him down more corridors, the strange glowing walls surrounding them. There were no words exchanged between them, only silence. Varelia didn't hurry, moving at her own pace, almost as if she wasn't in any rush to get anywhere. For the first time since the crash, Eli didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt human again. They reached a small, plain room at the back of the palace, far from the gold and riches of the Emperor's chambers. It wasn't much: a bed, a small table, a couple of books. It was simple. No guards, no servants. It was nothing like what Eli expected a princess's room to be. "You will stay here," Varelia said softly, her eyes avoiding his. Eli sat down on the floor, his wrists still bound by the chains. His mind was racing. Why had she saved him? Why did she want him? She was royalty. He was nothing. She could have let him be executed, but instead she chose him. "Why?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Why did you ask for me?" Varelia didn't answer immediately. She sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Her silver hair spilled over her shoulders, her gaze distant, as though lost in thought. "I don't know," she whispered finally. "Maybe because you're different. Or maybe because I am." Eli could feel the weight of her words, even if he didn't fully understand them. She wasn't just saving him. She was giving him something he hadn't realized he needed until now. Eli spent the night in the small room Varelia had given him, but sleep didn't come easily. His body was sore from the crash, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion. He tried to make sense of everything. How had he ended up here, in this strange alien palace? Why had the princess saved him when everyone else seemed to see him as nothing more than a joke? The next morning, Varelia came in quietly, as she always did. She didn't knock. She just appeared in the doorway, a soft presence in the room. Eli looked up at her from where he sat on the floor, his hands still bound. She placed a tray of food on the small table between them. It was simple: fruits, some bread, and a drink that smelled faintly of herbs. But the sight of it felt like a small act of kindness, a rare thing in this cold, unfamiliar place. Varelia didn't sit with him. Instead, she stood off to the side, watching him. Her silver hair shimmered in the soft light that filtered through the room, and her eyes, glowing faintly, seemed distant, like she was lost in a world that didn't quite fit her. Eli reached for the food, but before he took a bite, he couldn't help himself. He had to ask, "Why did you save me?" Her expression didn't change immediately. She just stared at him, the sadness in her eyes deepening. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one has ever thanked me before. No one ever sees me. They all think I'm just a shadow, a useless princess." Eli felt a pang in his chest. "You're not useless," he said, though the words felt awkward, out of place. What could he, a stranger, say to her to make her feel better? Varelia didn't reply. She simply lowered her gaze, staring at her hands, almost as if she were ashamed of something. There was a long, uncomfortable silence between them. The kind that made Eli feel like an outsider in a place he didn't belong. That night, something changed. Varelia came to him again, but this time, her eyes were more determined, less withdrawn. There was a new purpose in her step, something almost urgent. "Come with me," she said, a little breathless. "I need to show you something." Eli didn't hesitate. He followed her down the long, glowing corridors, their footsteps echoing softly in the silence. They passed through rooms that were too grand for him to understand, but Varelia didn't slow down. She moved quickly, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Finally, they reached a door. Metal, cold, and unmarked. Varelia glanced at Eli, and for the first time since their meeting, she seemed almost nervous. But there was something else, too. Something in her eyes that told Eli this wasn't just about him. This was personal. She opened the door. Inside, Eli's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a room fit for royalty. It was a lab, filled with strange tools, glowing screens, and odd alien technology that hummed softly in the background. Medical reports floated in the air, their contents impossible to read. Holographic images of DNA twisted and turned before Eli's eyes, too advanced for him to comprehend. This wasn't a princess's room. This was the room of a scientist. A researcher. Varelia stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she approached a central machine. She activated it with a few quick gestures, and a soft blue light bathed her face. "I'm not just broken," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I tried to fix myself." She tapped the hologram of her DNA. Eli watched, fascinated, as the 3D image rotated in midair. "I've studied every healer, every myth, every scan, but they say I'm cursed. They say my womb is dead." She turned to him, her face full of quiet desperation. "But I think they're wrong. I think they're just afraid." Eli stepped closer, unable to take his eyes off the hologram. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. "You built all of this yourself?" he asked, his voice thick with awe. Varelia nodded, her eyes meeting his. "No one helped me. No one cared. I had to teach myself. I want to be more than the forgotten daughter. I want to be something else, something more." Her voice trembled as she spoke the last word, but there was fire in her eyes. Eli stared at the screen. Something caught his attention. A pattern. A strange structure in her DNA. Something that didn't belong. "What is this?" he asked, pointing at it. Varelia's eyes widened. "You see it too?" He nodded. "It looks like a blocker, something artificial, like a lock." Varelia stepped back, staring at the screen in disbelief. "They did this to me, my own bloodline. They cursed me." Eli's mind raced. "Who did this? Why?" Varelia looked at him, her gaze hardening. "Because I was born under the wrong star. My birth sign predicted I would bring change. The high priests called it a cursed omen. My father feared it, so he made sure I could never rise." The weight of her words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. He had no idea what kind of empire he had stumbled into, but it was clear now. Varelia's family had done this to her. They had tried to control her, to suppress her potential. And now she was trapped. Eli swallowed hard. "But you're not trapped. You don't have to stay like this." Varelia's eyes flickered with a mix of hope and fear. "What if I can fix it?" she whispered. "What if I can have a child? What if I can change everything?" Eli looked at her, a thought forming in his mind. They could fix this. Together. "We can try," he said quietly. "I've seen how human biology works. We might be able to make something happen." They worked side by side for hours, piecing together a solution with the strange alien tech and Eli's own human knowledge. It was dangerous. It was risky. But it was their only hope. Finally, Eli crafted a tiny injector filled with nanobots, half alien, half human. He looked at Varelia, his hands shaking as he held the device. "Are you sure?" he asked. Varelia nodded. "For the first time in my life, I want to live my truth." Eli injected the nanobots into her arm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she screamed. Her body trembled, her veins lighting up with gold, her heart racing. Her eyes burned brighter than the moons outside. And then, everything went dark. The world was dark when Varelia awoke. Her eyes snapped open, but her body felt heavy, as if the very air itself was pressing down on her. A faint light illuminated the room, casting soft shadows across the walls. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed everything. The lab, the strange machine, the nanobots that Eli had injected into her. But no, she could still feel it. Something had changed. Eli was sitting beside her, watching her closely. His expression was a mix of concern and curiosity, and there was a hint of relief in his eyes when he saw her stir. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle, as though afraid she might shatter. Varelia slowly lifted her hand, touching her chest. She felt different, whole, in a way she hadn't felt in her entire life. There was no longer that gnawing emptiness inside her, the hollow space where she had always believed something essential was missing. I feel... She paused, as though the words weren't enough to describe it. "I feel complete." Eli smiled, though his eyes showed a flicker of worry. "I'm glad, but we don't have much time." Varelia's heart sank at the urgency in his voice. She sat up, her body still feeling weak but stronger than before. "What do you mean?" "They know," Eli said, his voice low. "Your sister, Princess Aya. She saw us together. She knows what we're trying to do." Varelia's face hardened, her jaw tightening at the mention of her sister's name. Aya had always been the favored one, the one with the power, the one who could do no wrong in their father's eyes. But Varelia knew the truth. Aya despised her, and now, with the revelation of what she was trying to accomplish, that hatred would only grow. "They'll come for us," Varelia whispered, more to herself than to Eli. "My father won't let me live like this. Not now that I've changed the rules. He'll never allow it." Eli stood up, his expression fierce. "Then we leave. We don't wait around for them to come after us. We run." Varelia shook her head. She wasn't sure where they could run to, not in a galaxy controlled by her father's empire. "There's nowhere to go, Eli. Not while he rules." But Eli wasn't deterred. He moved to the window, staring out at the palace grounds below, where the starlit garden stretched beneath the dark sky. "Then we make a new way, together." Varelia's heart skipped a beat. His words, so simple and yet so powerful, made something stir within her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a prisoner. For the first time, she felt like she could be something more than just the Emperor's broken daughter. The next few days were a blur. Varelia and Eli worked tirelessly in the hidden lab, refining their research, learning more about the technology and biology that could free her from the curse her father had placed on her. They were no longer just working together. They were becoming something else, something deeper. They were partners in this fight. But more than that, they were connected in a way that neither had ever expected. But outside the safety of their secret lab, the danger was growing. Princess Aya had already alerted the royal guards. Varelia's every move was being watched. The royal palace had become a pressure cooker, the tension thick enough to suffocate anyone who dared breathe it in. Then, one night, everything changed. The moon above the palace turned red, casting a strange glow over the royal gardens. The sounds of a royal feast echoed through the halls, laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. But Varelia didn't join the feast. She stayed with Eli, hidden away from the celebrations, where they could talk freely without the watchful eyes of their family. Varelia stood by Eli's door, her hands trembling slightly. She whispered, "Come with me." He didn't hesitate. Together, they slipped through the dark corridors, unnoticed by the guards. As they moved deeper into the palace, Varelia led him to the metal door, the one that Eli had seen before. But tonight, it was different. When they entered the lab, everything felt more real, more urgent. The air hummed with tension. "Varelia, what's going on?" Eli asked, his voice tight with concern. Varelia turned to him, her eyes shining with determination. "I'm not just going to sit here and wait to be controlled. I will have a child. I will break the chains they put on me." Eli's heart skipped. He could feel the weight of her words, the gravity of her desire to change everything. "But there's more," she continued. "There's something else I need to do. Something we both need to do." Eli looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Varelia's voice dropped to a whisper. "If they catch us, if my father finds out, everything will be lost. He'll destroy us, and our future will be nothing." "We'll fight," Eli said, his voice unwavering. Varelia turned to him, her expression softening. "I know, but we're not fighting alone." Meanwhile, in the heart of the palace, the Emperor had begun to realize that something was amiss. His spies had reported Eli and Varelia's growing connection, their secret work together, and the rumors of her newfound ability to have a child. He could feel the tide shifting, and for the first time he felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. The Emperor knew he couldn't let this go on. Not only would Varelia's new status threaten his control over the Empire, but the very existence of her unborn child, half human, half Valian, was a symbol of everything he feared: change, rebellion, and the rise of a new power. He summoned his inner circle, the shadow guards, and his most trusted assassins. "Stop them!" he growled. "Before they get any further, I don't care what it takes." Back in the secret lab, Eli and Varelia worked through the night, crafting plans and preparing for the worst. They knew the Emperor wouldn't give up easily, but they weren't about to let him control them any longer. As dawn broke, Varelia stood by the window, her face bathed in the first light of morning. She turned to Eli, her eyes filled with determination. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I'm not afraid anymore." Eli smiled at her, a soft, reassuring smile. "Neither am I." But outside, shadows were stirring. The palace guards moved silently, and assassins lurked in the corridors. The battle for their future was about to begin. The palace was quiet, unnervingly so. Eli could feel it in the air. Something was coming. Every instinct in his body screamed that time was running out. He sat beside Varelia, watching her as she stared out the window, her face bathed in the soft light of dawn. She looked calm, but he could see the tension in her posture, the tightness in her shoulders. "We don't have much time," Eli said, breaking the silence. Varelia nodded without turning. Her silver hair shimmered in the soft glow, her eyes still distant, as if she were somewhere far beyond the palace walls. "I know, but we have to be ready for what comes next." Eli stood up and paced the room, his mind racing. What if this all goes wrong? What if we can't stop him? Varelia turned to him, her eyes unwavering. We will. We're not alone anymore." Her words were a quiet promise, but something in her voice, something strong and unyielding, stirred something in Eli. He could feel the weight of their bond, the responsibility that had somehow fallen onto them both. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for change, for a future where they could live without fear. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, a heavy silence settled over the palace, like the calm before a storm. Eli could hear footsteps in the distance, too soft for soldiers, too smooth for servants. The palace had been on high alert ever since Varelia had been marked as a threat, and the guards were always watching. Varelia's expression shifted. Her eyes narrowed as she listened, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "They're here." Eli's heart skipped a beat. He walked to the door, his pulse quickening, but before he could reach the entrance, the sound of footsteps grew louder. He grabbed a nearby metal rod, holding it like a weapon. He wasn't trained for battle, but he'd fight if it came to that. The door burst open. 3 figures stepped inside, masked and silent. They wore dark armor, their movements smooth and calculated. Eli's grip tightened around the rod as the assassins advanced. The air seemed to hum with tension, the calm before the storm finally breaking. One of the assassins stepped forward, his eyes cold and empty. "You should not exist," he hissed, his voice low and rasping. The second assassin reached for Varelia. Without thinking, Eli lunged forward, swinging the rod to block the strike. The metal snapped in half under the force, but it was enough to throw the assassin off balance. Eli scrambled backward, feeling his side protest with every movement. Varelia, who had been standing behind him, stepped forward. Her hands glowed faintly, as if responding to the danger. She raised them, and suddenly, a burst of energy exploded from her palms, knocking the second assassin into the wall with a violent shockwave. Eli stared, his mouth open in shock. What was that?" Varelia's breath was shallow, her hands trembling. "I didn't know I could do that," she whispered, more to herself than to him. But the third assassin wasn't down. He lunged toward Varelia, his blade raised. Before Eli could react, a blaster shot rang out, and the assassin dropped to the floor, a dark stain spreading across the floor. Varelia gasped. Eli turned, his heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was Princess Aya, her expression hard and unreadable. She held a blaster in her hands, her gaze flickering between Varelia and Eli. "Why would you help us?" Varelia asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Aya sneered, her lips curling into a cold smile. "Don't misunderstand me, little sister. I still hate you. But killing a pregnant royal heir would destroy our empire." She paused, and for the briefest moment, Eli could see something flicker in her eyes, a strange, reluctant respect. "I may be cruel, but I'm not a fool." Without another word, Aya turned and walked away, leaving the palace hallway silent, but charged with the weight of what had just happened. Eli stood frozen, still processing what he had just witnessed. The princess who had spent her life in the shadow of her father's favor had just saved them. He looked over at Varelia, who was still holding her trembling hands, but her expression had changed. There was a new fire in her eyes, a fire that had been waiting to be unleashed. "We need to leave," Varelia said suddenly, her voice steady, but with an underlying urgency. "The Emperor will not let this go. We don't have much time before he tries again." Eli nodded. They couldn't stay in the palace any longer. It was no longer safe for either of them. The palace was in chaos. Rumors of what had happened spread quickly. The king's failed assassination attempt, the revelation that Varelia was pregnant with a hybrid heir, Everything was unraveling. Varelia and Eli moved quickly, silently, through the corridors. There was no more time for hesitation. They needed to escape, to get far away before the Emperor's wrath descended upon them again. As they reached the palace gates, the air was thick with tension. Eli could hear the distant sounds of guards shouting, of the palace descending into a frenzy. But Varelia didn't slow down. She moved like she had a purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going. And then they were outside. The cool night air hit Eli's face, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The stars above them seemed brighter than before, as though they were watching them, guiding them. But even in the quiet of the night, Eli knew they weren't safe yet. They couldn't outrun the Empire. Not easily. The Emperor had resources. He could track them, hunt them down. But Eli had a feeling they wouldn't be alone for long. The people were starting to rise against the tyranny of the Emperor. Whispers had begun, murmurs of support for Varelia, the heir of two worlds. Varelia glanced at him, her eyes fierce. "We're not alone, Eli. Not anymore." Eli nodded, determination settling in his chest. They were in this together. And no matter how many enemies they faced, they would fight for the future they had just begun to imagine. The night air was cold, the quiet of the palace gardens now replaced by an uneasy stillness. Eli and Varelia moved swiftly through the shadows, staying close to the walls of the palace as they made their way toward the outer gates. They could hear the distant sounds of commotion inside, the shouts of guards, the echo of orders, the unmistakable tension in the air. The palace was in full lockdown. Eli glanced over at Varelia. She was walking with purpose, her face set in a mask of determination, but there was something else there too. Something more vulnerable. Her eyes were filled with a mix of hope and fear. The pregnancy, the child she carried, was the key to everything now. To the future, to breaking free from the Emperor's grasp. "I can't believe we made it this far," Eli muttered, keeping his voice low. He couldn't help the disbelief in his words. The palace had been a cage, and yet now they were stepping into freedom. Varelia didn't respond right away. Her gaze was fixed on the path ahead, scanning for any signs of movement. But when she spoke, it was almost as if she were talking to herself. "I never thought I would be free. Not really, even after all the years of pretending, of being the forgotten one." She paused, her voice barely audible. "Now it's different. I'm different." Eli stepped closer, his heart aching for her. He knew what she meant. She had always been treated like a shadow in her family, invisible, unimportant. But now, she was carrying the future in her belly, the heir of two worlds. And that made her a threat to the very empire her father ruled. "Varelia, we're going to make this right," Eli said, his voice steady. "We'll face whatever comes next together. You won't be alone anymore." She turned to him, her eyes soft but full of a new fire. "I know." As they neared the gates, Eli's thoughts turned to the people beyond the palace walls. The citizens, the workers, the guards who had been loyal to the Emperor. Could they be swayed? Could they stand with Varelia against the might of the Empire? The gates loomed ahead. They were so close, but as they reached the edge of the palace grounds, a shout rang out in the distance. "Stop! You are not allowed to leave!" Eli froze, his heart pounding. A group of royal guards emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. There were too many of them, at least 10, their weapons drawn and ready. Behind them, the figure of Princess Aya appeared, her face cold and unreadable. "You can't leave," Aya said, her voice clipped. "Not after everything you've done."
Exorcism.
Varelia stepped forward, standing tall despite the fear creeping up her spine. You don't understand, Aya. I'm not just the daughter you've always hated. I'm carrying the future of this empire. You can't stop us. Aya's lips curled into a sneer. You think the people will support you? You're just a broken princess, Varelia. Nothing more. Varelia's gaze hardened. I'm not broken. And you... She paused, her voice trembling with emotion. You don't know what it's like to be trapped in a cage your entire life. Eli stepped closer to Varelia, his hand brushing hers. Varelia's right. We're not running from anything. We're building something new. And you can choose to stand with us, or against us. Aya's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, a deep, rumbling voice interrupted. Enough! All eyes turned. The Emperor stood at the edge of the palace courtyard, his regal figure looming above them. His expression was dark, his fury palpable. You think you can defy me? He growled, his voice trembling with anger. You're nothing. Just a traitor to your own blood. You betrayed everything I gave you. Varelia's expression didn't falter. No, father. You betrayed me. You cursed me. You made me believe I was broken, but I'm not. And this empire, our empire, is changing. The Emperor's eyes flicked toward Eli, and for a moment Eli thought he saw something else in the Emperor's gaze. Something almost like fear. You're nothing but a human, the Emperor spat. You should never have been allowed to touch her. Eli stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. You're wrong. I'm not just a human. I'm part of this. I'm here for her, for the future. The Emperor stepped forward, his hand raised as if to strike. You dare challenge me? His eyes locked with Varelia's. I will not let you destroy everything I've built. But as he moved toward them, something unexpected happened. A voice, old and wise, echoed through the palace courtyard. There is another way. An ancient priest, draped in ceremonial robes, stepped forward from the crowd of nobles and soldiers. The Emperor's eyes widened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. This union, the priest continued, his voice clear and strong. It was foretold. The child of two worlds, born of stars and earth, will bring change. The prophecy cannot be denied. The Emperor's rage boiled over. That prophecy was forbidden. It means nothing. But the priest didn't flinch. He lowered his head, bowing to Varelia and Eli. The people have spoken. The empire will not be the same. The bloodlines are no longer just yours to control. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. The royal guards, the nobles, even some of the soldiers exchanged glances. The tide was shifting. Varelia stepped forward, holding her head high. It's over, father. I'm not afraid anymore, and neither is Eli. The Emperor stared at her, his chest rising and falling with barely contained fury. His hands shook as he gripped the crown in his hands. For a moment, the entire palace stood still, as if waiting for the final verdict. With a sound that echoed like a thunderclap, the Emperor dropped the crown. It hit the marble floor with a deafening clang, rolling away from him like a symbol of his lost power. I was afraid, he whispered, his voice cracking. I was afraid you would rise above me. Varelia turned to Eli, her eyes softening. He stepped beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. We rise together, he said softly. The Emperor's voice broke through the silence one last time. This cannot be allowed. But as the words left his lips, something shifted. The high priests, the nobles, the soldiers, they all moved. One by one, they dropped to their knees, acknowledging the power of the new bloodline. The prophecy had come true. Varelia was no longer the broken princess. She was the future queen. The silence in the palace courtyard was heavy, thick with the weight of change. Varelia stood in the center of it all, her posture regal, her expression unwavering. The crowd of nobles, soldiers, and priests had all knelt in unison, their heads bowed in reverence. The emperor's reign was over, and the prophecy that had once been forbidden now felt as if it were an undeniable truth. Varelia, the forgotten princess, was no longer the shadow of the royal family. She was the light that would guide them into a new future. Eli stood beside her, his heart still racing from the events that had unfolded in the last few hours. He couldn't believe how much had changed in such a short time. But standing here, in the midst of it all, he knew one thing for certain. They had fought for this moment, and now they would stand together to build something better. Varelia turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and determination. "It's done," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly, but filled with an undeniable strength. Eli gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We did it. Together." There was no need for more words. Everything they had been through, every hardship, every moment of doubt, it had led them here, to this moment, to this new beginning. As the crowd slowly stood, the high priests raised their hands, and the nobles followed suit, all showing their allegiance to the new future that lay ahead. Even the guards, once loyal to the emperor, now looked to Varelia with respect. They had witnessed the power of her courage, the strength of her resolve. They saw her not as the broken princess they had been told she was, but as a queen worthy of the throne. Varelia raised her head, her gaze sweeping over the people before her. Her heart swelled with the weight of the responsibility that was now hers. But there was no fear, only a sense of purpose, of clarity. She would lead them all, into an era of change. "By the law of the stars," one of the priests spoke, his voice resonating through the courtyard, "a new queen rises." The crowd responded in a unified voice, chanting her name, shouting their support for the new ruler who would unite their worlds. The words echoed through the palace, carried on the wind, a powerful declaration of what was to come. "Varelia! Varelia! Long live the queen!" Varelia's eyes glistened with emotion, but she did not falter. She turned to Eli, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining. It was a quiet moment of shared understanding. They had both come so far, together. But the road ahead was not without its challenges. The emperor's supporters, those who still clung to the old ways, would not easily accept this shift in power. Varelia knew the empire was at a crossroads, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready. She had Eli by her side, and with the strength of the people behind her, she would face whatever came next. Later that evening, Varelia and Eli stood on the balcony of the palace, overlooking the city. The stars above were clear. A blanket of light stretched across the sky, and for a moment, it almost felt like they were the only two people in the universe. Eli wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "You've done it," he said softly, his voice full of admiration. "You're more than just a princess. You're the queen they needed." Varelia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm more than just the queen they needed. I'm the queen they chose." For a long time, Varelia had lived in the shadows of her family's expectations, trapped by the limitations imposed on her. She had been told she was broken, cursed, that she could never give life. But now, she carried the future of two worlds in her womb. Her child, their child, who would bring change, hope, and a new dawn to their empire. I'm ready, Eli, Varelia said, lifting her gaze to the stars. Ready to lead them into the future. To give them a future. Eli squeezed her hand, his voice firm but full of affection. And I'll be with you every step of the way. Varelia turned her gaze back to him, her expression softening. I know, I wouldn't want it any other way. Weeks later. The palace had been transformed. Gone were the cold, sterile halls that had once echoed with the Emperor's cruel commands. In their place, the atmosphere was filled with new life, hope, change, and an air of anticipation for what was to come. The people had rallied around their new queen, and slowly but surely, the empire began to shift. Varelia held court for the first time as queen, surrounded by her advisors, but this time it was different. The nobles who had once scoffed at her, the soldiers who had once scorned her, now looked to her with respect. She was no longer just the infertile princess, the one who had been cast aside. She was a queen who had fought for her people, for her right to lead. And she would not be silenced. Beside her, Eli stood as her partner, her confidant, the man who had believed in her when no one else had. Though he was not of royal blood, he was a vital part of this new world, a symbol of the union between two species. Two worlds. We will change the empire, Varelia declared one day in the grand hall, her voice carrying strength and warmth. But we will do it together, as equals, as partners. No one will be left behind. The crowd cheered, and for the first time the cheers were not of mockery or scorn, but of genuine support. The empire was changing, and they had all chosen to embrace that change. On the balcony, overlooking the city once more, Varelia and Eli stood side by side, the first rays of the morning sun casting a golden glow across the land. The sky was alive with promise. Below them, the people gathered, aliens and humans, side by side, united by the child that would soon be born, the heir who would carry the legacy of two worlds. Varelia smiled softly at Eli. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Eli smiled back, his eyes filled with love and hope. Yes, Varelia, this is just the beginning. And together, they looked toward the future, a future that held no fear, no chains, only possibilities,